Hello and welcome to Peston on Sunday. Coming up, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, will, I hope, tell us what she'd actually do if we re-elect her. And it's up the workers with one man who fervently wants to stop her re-entering number 10, the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. Helping me assess who gets the better of the arguments while scoffing my pastries, it's a big hello to Alistair Campbell, who used to be the muscle behind Tony Blair and is now a hack again, God help us, at the New European, and Camilla Cavendish, who was the brains behind David Cameron. Hiya. So she broke the habits of a lifetime and took an uncontrolled risk by unleashing the Foreign Secretary on the general election campaign, and he promptly accused him of being a mugwump, which he demonstrably isn't, because mugwump means politically independent, if only. Boris went on to say that we'd bomb Syria without parliamentary approval if America's president asked us to do so, which she seemed singularly unamused by. The coalition of chaos is her word for a possible future alliance between Sturgeon, Farron and Corbyn. But strong and stable, well, that probably doesn't describe her relationship with Johnson, unlike my relationship with you, Anushka, and Screeny.
Very strong and hopefully stable, Robert. Now, there is lots of coverage today of the EU27 taking just 4 minutes to come up with their Brexit guidelines that many say are pretty hardline. The Observer leading on that story saying Theresa May will need to make an offer on citizen rights before she gets trade talks. And they have an election story from our first guest, John McDonnell, a Labour 20-point offer on workers' rights. The Prime Minister making her own offers as well in the Mail on Sunday, promising to protect people's pensions from unscrupulous bosses. And she's also been talking about her favourite films. Number one, what a romantic, Casablanca. Bit more surprising that The Fugitive is number 2. Now, Theresa May wants to park her Tory tanks on Labour lawns. Will she be successful? This will be a worrying graph for the Labour Party. A poll last week shows that a 16-point lead among the middle classes is exactly replicated among what Labour might consider its core working class vote. But there is a fly in the ointment for the Tories if we break things down by age. Look at this. Jeremy Corbyn, a really strong lead here among young people and staying ahead all the way up to the magic crossover age of 34. As you get into middle age and then retirement, it all gets much more Tory. The problem for the Labour Party is that these voters, according to recent elections, are way more likely to turn out in June than this lot. Robert.
So I'm delighted to be joined by Alistair Campbell, Camilla Cavendish. The big news yesterday was EU leaders agreeing the guidelines for our Brexit talks. A number of important decisions taken by them, perhaps the most important being that they will not countenance trade discussions at all until we've agreed what we'll pay them as a sort of severance payment, and also till we've agreed what the status of EU migrants living here is and British migrants living on the continent will be. Camilla, how big a risk do you think there is of a breakdown in those negotiations pretty early?
Well, there's always a risk. There was never going to be a free lunch. I mean, they had to start with an opening position like this. I don't think it's at all surprising. It is a bit surprising they seem to have agreed this in 4 minutes and then broke for lunch. And actually, given Juncker's comments about the dinner at Chequers, the food seems to be quite an important part of these negotiations. But actually, I think if you look at the small print, they want her to agree to things in principle. So we don't have to settle all the bills up front, and we don't necessarily have to agree all the rights up front. They want to know the shape going forward. And I've always thought that Britain is going to have to foot some of those bills for goodwill, you know, as well as everything else. And I've always thought that we will have to agree as soon as possible on EU citizens' rights. So I don't think it's impossible to move forward from this.
Alistair, the other thing that the guidelines said was no sector-by-sector deal when it comes to the trade talks. How difficult will that make it, either for a Tory government or a Labour government, to come up with a deal that actually works for the British economy?
I mean, I think what happened yesterday was that the kind of la-la land approach that we've been having, where there's this sort of fantasy about what's going to happen, is being confronted with the reality of a united, strategic, incredibly experienced in this negotiation, these sorts of negotiations. Admittedly, this is bigger than anything any of them ever done. And that reality is now going to confront a Prime Minister who is having this election on this myth, in my view. It's this line, she'll say it on your programme because she's very good at staying on message, that she needs to strengthen her hand. Every vote will strengthen her hand. These 27 countries, they don't give a damn what her majority is. We are now exiting the European Union. She has decided to go for a hard Brexit approach, and she's going to go for Brexit at any cost, and they know that. And
Alistair, sorry, that's why it does matter what her majority
No, well,
Well, hang on a second. We're going to hang on. We've got so much more to talk about a bit later on in the programme. More from Alistair and Camilla later. Now, I'm really pleased to be joined by Labour's Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. John, very nice to see you on the day that you announce a 20-point plan to boost the power, the earning ability of workers. A good chunk of it represents probably the biggest shift back to trade unions of power. I was trying to work out probably since the immediate post-war period. Now, convention would say that the British people don't vote for measures that strengthen trade unions. You're taking quite a big risk here, aren't you?
It's more about giving people security. Take a few examples from the programme itself. We're going to end 0 hours contracts. We're going to introduce what they call the New Zealand model, where you can be assured of the hours that you're going to work. And the reason for that is I just give examples from my own constituency of families that don't know what hours they're going to work that week, what income they'll have, can't tell their kids whether or not they can afford, well, that new coat next week, or whether they can go on holiday this year. We're trying to give them security. And, you know, it's not asking the earth. And interesting enough, you know, on this particular issue, companies like McDonald's now are beginning to move. I campaigned on this. And
I want to come back to you about this whole issue of 0 hours contracts and workers' rights. But, for example, you are saying, for example, that you want trade unions to have the power to negotiate sectoral wage deals, right? Now, that would be a revolution in the way that pay is set in this country.
What's happened in this country over the last 20-odd years is collective bargaining has declined.
Yep.
80% of our workforce used to be covered by collective bargaining. It's down to about 20% now, and that's eroded wages overall. And we can't live in a society. It goes completely contrary to British values, where we saw this morning the reports of British nurses having a pay cut now of 12% over the last, 7 or 8 years. British nurses, RCN are now saying our nurses are having to go to food banks because they can't feed themselves on the wages that they get. That runs contrary to everything we believe in as a society. So it's looking at those issues to make sure people have secure employment, but also when they go to work, they have a level of income that enables them, actually to put food on their plates. You know?
But just to sort of talk to you about how this would work in practice. So let's take the car industry. Yeah. You're basically saying that trade unions in the car industry would be able to negotiate as a group with all car employers about what the pay rise should be across the whole industry.
We want to try and get back to basic pay rates overall, because in that way you can actually get to a situation where people are properly paid, they can know what their payments will be, because in many instances now what we're finding is wages are so low. Not only do people having to go to food banks, last year 1.25 million parcels handed out, but in addition to that, people having to borrow. Household debt has risen dramatically because people are having to go to payday lenders and others. We just need to get back to a fair society again.
Now, nobody can dispute the statistics, which shows that the pay of people has been stagnating for years. But at the same time, and I think it's important to make this point, unemployment in this country has been falling sharply. And some people would argue that the reason unemployment actually came down faster than in much of the rest of Europe is actually because the costs of employment in this country are lower. And that is to do with the kind of regulations that don't exist here, which do exist there. So isn't the risk of what you're proposing a rise in unemployment?
Certainly not. What's unfair at the moment is that we've got growth back into our economy, but we're the only major developed country where we've got growth, but wages are stagnating or going backwards. That cannot be right. that means there's unfairness in the distribution of rewards within our society. And all we're asking for is that fairness.
But it is basic economics, John. I mean, if the cost of employment goes up, fewer people will be employed.
Well, if you increase your productivity, that's what we'll do with our investment. It means that you can maintain employment and grow it. But in addition to that, you can maintain the levels of wages. And what we're going for is an economy with high skills and high wages. It's all about having an economic process in which the workers and the businesses are involved in developing the economy in all their interests.
Now, there are some people in Britain who like the flexibility of not being tied to a formal contract. Are you going to say that they simply can't have, let's just say they want 0 hours contracts, are you saying they simply can't have them?
If you look at what all the various pieces of research, most people want to ensure that they have the hours guaranteed, and you can negotiate then with your employer any additional hours, and you can come to a reasonable agreement. There'll always be some who need some special preferences, obviously, but we still want to ensure that people have guaranteed hours and they're negotiated properly and wages match those hours as well. It's not asking for the earth, you know, and the way it's balanced at the moment is that people can't tell what hours they're working, don't know what income's coming in, they're falling back on debt, and as I say, in some instances, this growth in dependence on food banks is unacceptable in, the 6th richest country in the world.
Now, the other important element in your plan is the ending of the cap on pay rises for public sector workers. That's a cap of 1% a year at the moment. And in particular, quite a lot more money going to nurses and people working in the health service. That looks like a cost of about £5 billion or so per year. How are you going to pay for that?
No, the government's figures, if you look at it, it said £5 billion over a number of years. 1% increase in pay.
Well, it depends how much you it depends how much you actually you increase.
Okay, if you say 1% increase is about 1.25 billion overall. You grow the economy, you can afford that. But in addition to that, we need to have a fair taxation system. There's no doubt about that. The issue for us is we would not make the same choices of this government. What this government has made the choice is to give away tax giveaways, corporations and the rich. We would not make those choices.
Can I just ask you a question, though, on that? I mean, obviously, you've got the borrowing that you're planning to do for infrastructure and your investment bank. But when it comes to issues like funding public sector pay increases or more money for schools and hospitals, are you proposing in your manifesto to show how you will pay for all of those with tax rises?
No, what we'll be doing is we'll have every policy fully costed, and beside that costing will be the funding source. And
some of it will be borrowing, will it?
Well, borrowing for infrastructure, but not day-to-day spending.
That's the question I'm
asking you. Well, that's our fiscal rule. We're not going to be
So there will be tax rises matching every single one of your day-to-day spending commitments.
We'll end the tax giveaways to the corporations and the rich. We'll demonstrate item by item how we will fund those, and that will be about a fair taxation system. But let me give this assurance. There will be no increases in income tax for middle and low earners.
But you need to define what middle and low income...
Yes, we will.
What do you mean? So in your manifesto, you will tell us...
We will define that. It'll all be costed.
Can you tell me now what you see as the middle income?
We're looking... The only increases will be on that higher percentages, and that will be in our manifesto.
Is that people on more than 100,000? Or...
You'll see... We'll define that in our manifesto. You'll see it very, very clearly. In fact, I'll let you know. You'll be the first to know, OK? But let me just say this. I did ask the government, you remember, because I think I was on the show at the time, I asked the government, could all the opposition parties have access to the Office of Budget Responsibility to cost our programme? They refused. When we go into government, that will be open to all political parties to have access to that information, that assessment, because it will raise the level and standard of our debate about economic policy making overall, and we'll be able to verify the figures of everybody there.
And you're not frightened of what happened to Labour governments in the past, that there will just be a barrage of media attacks on you for allegedly soaking ordinary working people?
There's going to be a barrage of attacks. But the issue around fair taxation is that we will protect middle and low earners. I will say also, we will not increase VAT. And I want you to ask Theresa May that question as well, because if you remember last time, the Tories promised no increase in VAT, and then they increased it afterwards. And that falls on, that's a regressive tax, it falls on some of the poorest and middle earners as well. So that's one guarantee we're giving.
Can I just ask you on one question, though? you are also guaranteeing the triple
Yes, we
lock.
are.
But all the evidence now shows that people over 65 are on higher incomes than working people. In a sense, you are promoting a policy that actually increases inequality.
Let me take you back in history on this one, because I've got a bit of form on this. When Mrs Thatcher broke the link with earnings in the 1980s, I campaigned against it then. I have done for the last 30 years. And
But older people have done very well in the last few years.
There's still 1.7 million older people, pensioners, in poverty at the moment.
So target the resources
and
at the poorer pensioners.
what we want to do is we believe in universalism. We want to lift everybody out of... And what you saw from the research this morning, that was published this morning, you'll see that if they break the triple lock, it'll be some of the poorest that lose out. And actually also, it'll be young people for the future. And the research that was published by Hamers this morning will tell you pensioners will not be protected. I do not want to go backwards. I do not want pensioners going back into poverty
now,
again.
very briefly, because unfortunately we are almost out of time, the polls do not only show that you're behind, but they also show that your leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is a big negative for many voters.
Yeah. Don't believe the polls, but let me just the polls are moving in our direction anyway, but who can tell? On the doorstep, that's not the case. I think if you saw Jeremy's speech yesterday, and I think the human side of Jeremy came, he doesn't talk about himself much, but he did yesterday, the human side of him came, you saw a decent, principled, very strong person who stood strong on a number of issues over the years and actually was proved right.
John McDonnell, many thanks for coming in. I hope to see you again in the course of the campaign. So, let's chew over some of that with Alistair and Camilla. Alistair, you know, Tony Blair took the view that it was impossible to win a general election unless you were seen to be standing up to trade unions. This is a Labour Party which is running on a platform of transferring extraordinary amounts of power back to trade unions.
I don't think Tony saw it in terms of standing up to the trade unions. I mean, he certainly took the view that you have to govern in the centre and campaign from the centre. But I think my thing about this election is actually that you've now got, particularly with Brexit, and I do wish there'd have been a bit of Brexit in that interview, because I think this is the elephant in the room in this election. This election is being called because of Brexit. She'll no doubt tell you when she arrives that she wants this big majority so she can strengthen her hand, which I've said to you earlier, I think is a myth. So I don't think it's about...
But people are going to lose the will to live if this entire campaign is about Brexit, and therefore it is important. And this is a serious policy that John McDonnell has come up with, where, you know, when it comes to, you know, the power of working people. And what I want to know from you is, you know, is this, in your view, the right way for Labour to go, or a catastrophe?
Jeremy Corbyn has to take forward the policies that he wants to take according to the beliefs that he has. My point is that...
It's not exactly an endorsement.
No, wait a minute. Let me go back to the point that I want to make, which is why I think that this is about Brexit. And I think what Labour has to do, as well as putting forward all these policies on the economy and public services, we do have to expose the reality of what is going on with Theresa May's strategy on Brexit. Because to go back to our earlier discussion about what happened yesterday, she is going into this she's got through the referendum, she's now become Prime Minister, she's going through an election campaign, she's got to be challenged and exposed over what deal we are going to get, because it's going to be worse than what we've got now. Now, I don't think Labour's going to get listened on the policies until we've engaged more on that argument.
Well, we'll come back to both you and particularly Camilla later when we've heard from the Prime Minister. Don't go away, because Theresa May will be here live in the studio in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Peston on Sunday. I'm delighted to be joined by the Prime Minister, Theresa May. Prime Minister, could I take you back to July the 13th of last year? You're standing on the pavement outside of 10 Downing Street, and you say that your vision is building a society, a Britain that works for everyone. And there's a huge amount in that address about lifting up poorer people. Every serious think tank, the IFS, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Resolution Foundation, says that over the next few years, the poor will get poorer relative to the rich. That's not what you want, is it?
Well, you're absolutely right. When I stood on Downing Street back on the 13th of July last year, I set out my vision for a country that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. There were a number of elements of that. Some of that was, of dealing with injustices that I feel in society today, and we've put in place a number of things already that will address some of those issues. I made a speech earlier this year, for example, about how we can put more into supporting people with mental health problems. I've set up a audit to ensure that we look at how the public services actually deal with people from different, from black and minority ethnic communities, a discrimination survey, looking at audit of public services. So setting in place the steps that actually help us deal with those injustices. But looking at those people who are, as I've said, perhaps struggling, they've in work, but they perhaps find it worrying about whether they've got job security. They're paying a mortgage, but they're in their home, but they find it a bit worrying about paying the mortgage. Sorry,
please.
But the important thing is to strengthen our economy so that we can ensure that we can create more secure jobs and higher paid jobs for people into the future. Now, doing that's about Brexit and getting it right. It's also about taking this country beyond Brexit.
But the current forecasts, based on the idea that actually you were going to be in power for the next few years, have incredibly slow earnings growth predicted by most economists. And at the same time, benefit changes introduced by your government are seen by, again, every analyst as disproportionately hurting the poorer. Is that something you will address if you are re-elected?
Well, there have been welfare changes that have come under the Conservative government. That's absolutely right. A number of reasons why we've done that. I mean, first of all, we're introducing a simpler welfare system in universal credit, but also a welfare system that helps to encourage people into the workplace. I think work is the best route out of poverty. And yes, we need a system that does provide support for those who need it, but I think we do need to incentivise people to get into the workplace. We also have to think, when we're looking at welfare, for the taxpayers who are paying for those welfare benefits. Some of the very people we've just been speaking about who do find it difficult to make ends meet are actually those who are contributing to the benefits of others through their taxes.
But if the gap between rich and poor were to widen on your watch, would you regard that as a failure?
Well, I want to see, absolutely, as I said last year, I want to see the country that works for everyone. That's about developing a stronger economy. You only do that with strong and stable government.
Sounds as though you think it would be a failure. If you say you wanted to work for everyone, then you want to lift up the poorest.
I want to lift up. What I want in this country is I want to see a country where people are able to get on in life and see a better future for themselves and their children and their grandchildren. That's about a whole range of issues that we need to address. It's about ensuring we see growth and prosperity across the whole of the country. It's about ensuring we provide opportunity for all so that we have a good school place for every child. And in doing that, that we ensure that we're a meritocracy, that how you get on in our country is about your talents and your hard work. That's what I want to see.
But if we look at the tax changes that actually were introduced or promised since you became Prime Minister, which is the promise to raise the threshold for 40% tax and raise the tax-free threshold, again, all the work shows that disproportionately helps people on above average incomes.
Well, what we've done by raising the threshold of the personal allowance is, of course, taken 4 million people out of paying income tax altogether. So 4 million people who were on the very lowest of earnings not paying income tax any longer. And the changes we've made mean that a basic rate taxpayer is about £1,000 a year better off as a result of those changes.
But even so, most of the money is going to people who I think would be above your threshold of just about managing, and that must worry you, surely.
Well, but if you look at the tax, the percentage of tax that's being paid by the very richest, the top 1% of people are actually paying a higher percentage of tax, higher percentage of the overall.
You regard that as fair,
yes,
don't you?
but the point is they're paying a higher share of the burden, a higher percentage of the overall income tax than they did in any year under the Labour government. It is right that you get the right system of taxation. The Conservative Party has always been a party that believes in lower taxation, and that's what we want to do for the future. We absolutely want to reduce taxes on working families.
So David Cameron promised £1 million essentially tax-free for couples on inheritance tax. Is that something that you think should be a priority?
Well, there are many people in this country who, because of what has happened to the property market, find themselves, people who are in fairly, what some people would consider to be ordinary circumstances, but find themselves potentially caught by this issue. That's been an important issue for a lot of people. But if you look
But is it a
across,
priority at a time of scarce resources?
If you look across what we want to do on taxes, we've no plans to increase the level of tax. As I say, as a Conservative party, we're a party that believes in lower taxation. And I think that's the key choice that people will face at the election, is a contrast between a Conservative party that does believe, that does want to reduce taxes on working families, that has, as I say, taken millions of people out of paying tax income tax altogether, and a Labour Party who want to increase taxes and whose policies would lead to them increasing taxes.
I mean, on that, we had John McDonnell sitting just where you were a couple of minutes ago, and he was very explicit that for those that they see as above middling incomes, they want to put taxes up. Given what you say your record as a party is on taxes, do you need to repeat David Cameron's triple lock, no rise in VAT, no rise in income tax, no rise in national insurance? Do you need to repeat that?
Well, I'm clear that we have no plans to raise the level of tax.
What does the level mean? I'm not sure what that means.
In relation to specific taxes, we won't be increasing VAT, but what I do want to ensure is that we are able to have
you definitely won't raise VAT. That's a 100% commitment.
But what I want to do is to ensure that when we do look more widely at the tax system, that what we say on the tax system, we're absolutely clear we can deliver on it for people. And also, as I say, I want to see us able to reduce taxes on working families. And that can only be done with strong and stable leadership. It can only be done with a strong and stable government, building that stronger economy.
But it does sound to me that what really matters to you, apart from VAT, is the sort of overall burden of taxation rather than micromanaging at this stage individual tax rates.
Well, I think it's important that we look at that overall burden of taxation. As I say, my desire, my instinct, and what I absolutely want to do is to be able to reduce taxes on working families. But we are only able to do any of this if we build that strong economy. And that's why it's important to have that strong and stable government that can deliver on that strong economy. I think Jeremy Corbyn's economic policies are nonsensical. I think they just don't add up.
Now, something remarkable happened over the last few years, which is actually almost the first time, certainly in recorded history, those who've retired have now larger incomes after housing costs than working people on average. Part of that has been driven by your triple lock protection for state pensions for older people. Actually, shouldn't you redress the balance more towards working people? Isn't it time for that triple lock to end?
Well, under a Conservative government, the state pension will still increase every year. Now, precisely how we calculate that increase will be a matter for the manifesto. But if you look, as you say, pensioners' incomes have improved. The changes that have been made to basic state pension mean that pensioners are £1,250 a year better off. And as I say, under a Conservative government, pensions would continue to increase state pensions would continue to increase every year. But the issue that you raised, the wider issue you've raised there, Robert, is a really important one about this intergenerational fairness. And that is a factor of a whole range of things. There are people today who really worry about whether their children and grandchildren are going to have a better future than they did, than they've had. But it's about a range of issues. It's about ensuring that we have that strong economy, creating those secure and higher paid jobs. It's about ensuring we're building more affordable homes. It's about making sure there's opportunity for all through a good school place for every child, through ensuring we're giving young people the opportunity to get the skills to take on those high paid jobs.
So just to be clear about this, I don't think I'd be wrong, would I, to assume that you'll probably drop that 2.5% minimum increase for pensions?
You would be wrong to make any assumptions. As I said, precisely how we...
But it does sound as though you're going to a double lock, not a triple lock,
Precisely how we calculate that increase will be a matter for the manifesto. If you want to know what's in our manifesto, wait and read our manifesto.
So please don't go away, because we've got more from the Prime Minister in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back. I'm very pleased that the Prime Minister's work visa has been extended and she's still with me. But first, here's Anushka.
Thanks, Robert. Lots of reaction. The hacks have spotted a story because the Prime Minister has followed John McDonnell in saying there will be no rises in VAT, although that clearly leaves wriggle room in other areas. Others are commenting on the issue of inequality. We have an Evening Standard journalist here saying Theresa May dodges whether it will be a failure if the gap between the rich and poor grows on her watch or if she'll help the poorest. There's also some reaction on the issue of Brexit. Francis O'Grady here, the General Secretary of the TUC, saying, can the PM guarantee that UK workers' rights won't fall behind the rest of Europe? Well, talking about Brexit, there is something this week that has had Brexiteers applauding but might be quite sad for about 48% of you. Look at this European Commission map. They've greyed us out already. It's a bit like deleting your ex from Facebook. Now, the Prime Minister says she wants to remain Bezies, but if you'll allow me to flog the analogy here, she is ready to press the unfriend button if necessary. She has said again today that no deal is better than a bad deal. But what does no deal actually look like? Well, this is what the experts warn of, if you believe them. They say that British citizens living on the continent could be at risk of losing rights, for example, to free healthcare. They also warn of tariffs. WTO rules would put 36% on dairy products, a worry for British farmers. And that is a car park on the M20, because if there is no agreement on customs, then there could be onerous checks in places like Dover. Now, some civil servants are already looking at the possibility of no deal, and given the tough talk from this lot yesterday, perhaps it could be more likely. Robert.
Prime Minister, just to pick up on that, do you genuinely in your heart of hearts believe that no deal would be better than a bad deal?
Yes, I do. I wouldn't have said it if I didn't believe that. But what I also believe is that with the right strong hand in negotiations, we can get a good deal for the UK from these negotiations. That's what I want to do. But I believe you need to have strong and stable leadership in order to be able to achieve that.
But if no deal is a realistic, non-disastrous outcome, shouldn't you be planning now to expand warehouse capacity at ports, recruiting people to do customs checks? Because we'll need all of that if we were to crash out.
I'm very clear that I want to go in there with a strong hand to negotiate a good deal for the United Kingdom. And actually,
but wouldn't your hand be strengthened if you prepared Britain now for no deal?
I think my hand will be strengthened if at this election people voting in the national interest vote for the leadership, the strong and stable leadership and the strong and stable government that this country needs. But if we look at what is happening in relation to the negotiations, which of course haven't formally started with the European Union yet, if you look at the guidelines they've set out for their position and my Article 50 letter, there's a lot that actually we agree on, wanting to have that good and special partnership into the future. Wanting to be able to give reassurance to EU citizens living here and UK citizens living in those other 27 countries. There's a lot that we can agree on between us, but of course the negotiations will be tough at times. We've seen that from some of the comments that have come out recently.
Now, they want us to hand over quite a lot of money to them, the money they think we owe under our previous budget promises. They said yesterday in their guidelines that they would not start to talk about trade with us, a future trade deal, unless we agree the elements of what we will pay them. What do you think about that?
Well, what I think is that, first of all, it's important that at the point at which we leave, we know what the future relationship is going to be, and that's about the future trade relationship, but also cooperation on other areas like security, for example.
Does everything have to be nailed down at that point?
I think it's important that when we leave, what I don't want to see is a cliff edge where suddenly nobody knows, 1 minute after midnight on the appointed day what their situation is. That's why we've said we'll bring EU law into UK law so that there's a smooth process. And I think at that point people should know what the future trade
broad
relationship is.
parameters of the trade relationship.
Well, they should know. I think we should be looking to negotiate a comprehensive free trade agreement within this period of time that we've got.
You think that's realistic, do you?
Well, I do, because if you think about it, we're in a different position from other countries. It's not like we're a third country who's starting negotiations with them. We've actually been part of the European Union. We still are at the moment, a member of the European Union. We're operating on the same basis. So we're starting from an entirely different point. So I think that actually us negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement will be easier, should be easier, and that we can do that within the time frame we've got.
Are you prepared to wait till at least the basis of what we pay them is agreed?
Well, we will start the formal negotiations in June. There are a number of things that I think that we need to agree at a very early stage. The issue of EU citizens living here...
So you agree with them that
UK
that's got
citizens.
to be agreed at an early stage?
I want that to be, yes, that was in my Article 50 letter.
Yep.
It's in their guidelines. I think there's
So there's
goodwill
no
on both
dispute
sides.
there.
So we
Is there a
reassurance on that.
dispute, though, about how fast we can progress this issue on budget payments?
Well, if you look at some of the things that have been said, it's been very clear from a number of leaders that they actually want to get on to the overall package, if you like, the trade issues, also fairly quickly through this process.
But they were also very clear in the guidelines that they will negotiate as one. We can't look to individual leaders who are sympathetic. We've got to look at where the weight of opinion is. And the weight of opinion appears to be that they will not talk trade with us until they know what we're going to pay them, if not to the penny, at least in broad terms.
They have, what they've said is that they want to start those discussions before they start discussing the issues around trade. You're right, they're very clear they're going to negotiate as 27. But I think exactly this sort of issue is why it's important that we have the right leadership in this country to ensure that we've got a strong hand in those negotiations and that we're able to take our arguments and our message through those negotiations and get the right deal at the end of those negotiations.
But in your terms, you know, since you want to be Prime Minister, you already had the right leadership. And they're saying the size of your majority doesn't matter at all.
Well, I think it's important that we have a strong hand. I believe a mandate. I genuinely believe that this is the most important election the country has faced in my lifetime. And I think it's important that everybody goes out and votes on June the 8th. Obviously, I'm around the country asking people to vote for me and my team on June the 8th, because I think we would give that strong leadership, that strong and stable government that's necessary for these negotiations. But the reason why I thought it was important to have this election was having done the first job, if you like, in Brexit, which is sending that Article 50 letter, triggering the formal process. It was clear that other parties wanted to frustrate the negotiations, disrupt the negotiations and frustrate that process. I believe it's important to have that mandate, to take a strong hand into the negotiations, because this is about our future. It's about getting the best deal for the United Kingdom, but it's also about a government of 5 years of certainty and a government that can take this country not just through Brexit, but beyond.
Some people feel you haven't told them enough about your vision of Brexit, given that you are making this election a mandate for you to negotiate our exit.
Well, I've set out in my Lancaster House, I made a speech in January in Lancaster House, setting out our objectives in relation to Brexit, and I noticed Francis O'Grady there had tweeted a question about workers' rights.
Yep.
I was clear in that speech that I gave that one of our objectives is the protection of workers' rights.
So they
Indeed,
will
I
not
want to
be.
enhance
So you give a
workers' rights.
commitment they will not be eroded.
We want to protect workers' rights and indeed look at enhancing workers' rights. It's why, for example, I've asked Matthew Taylor to do this study on the employment market at the moment to say, have we got the right protections in place and the right regulations in place for what is a changing type of employment market?
Now, we did ask our viewers what they wanted to ask you, and I absolutely promise you we haven't fixed this, because by far the largest number of questions were about why you won't participate in a TV debate. Is there any chance you'll change your mind on this? I mean, what this chap called Fox says is you would have a much bigger audience, particularly with young people, if you did this.
there isn't going to be any change, because the sort of campaign I want to run, and the sort of campaign I'll be involved in, is one that is about getting out and about, getting across the whole country, meeting people from all sorts of communities, getting into communities that have felt up till now that politicians have ignored them, have not been taking their concerns into account. I want to get out there and about. That's what this is about.
Now, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. I've got two quite quick questions. One is, there's a report in the Sunday Times that you are looking at giving tax breaks to encourage people to save for social care, for their costs when they become too frail to look after themselves. Is that something you're thinking about?
We are looking at how we can ensure that social care, we have a sustainable system of social care. A lot of pressure on social care. I've said it's to be dealt with in short-term measures, which is the £2 billion extra we put into social care in the budget. The medium term, we need best practice across the whole country.
Encouraging people themselves
and
to save with perhaps a tax break, that's something we're thinking about,
longer term, we need a sustainable system of social care. This is one of the issues that I think, one of the long-term issues for this country that we need to address. And again, these are the sorts of issues that we'll be looking at in our manifesto.
Now, I also noticed in your Mail on Sunday interview, you chose your 3 favourite dishes. They all sounded absolutely wonderful to me. Was nothing for the vegetarians, though. These were quite meaty.
Yes, actually, they did all have. But then I do cook vegetarian dishes as well, I can assure you. But
that's a great relief.
Those are my favourites.
Anyway, very nice to have you with us, Prime Minister, and hope to see you again within the course of what's going to be a very exciting campaign. So my thanks to the Prime Minister. We'll be getting reaction from our gurus in just a couple of minutes. Welcome back to Peston on Sunday. Alistair Campbell and Camilla Cavendish are still with me, and there's a lot to chew over. Camilla, you used to work on policy with David Cameron in 10 Downing Street. Listening to the Prime Minister, what did you think that you learned about the shape of the manifesto she will be unveiling quite soon?
Well, I think the manifesto will probably be quite broad brush. But she did say, I think for the first time, that she won't increase VAT. Matching John McDonnell's pledge, in a sense. But equally, I was glad that she didn't try and match Labour's pledge to protect the triple lock, because...
It was quite interesting that she absolutely went out of her way not to say she wouldn't raise national insurance and income tax. It was only about
And
VAT.
I think she's right. I mean, John McDonnell didn't act as if Brexit isn't happening. I mean, we need more flexibility in the public finances. We're still, as a country, spending more than we earn, but we're actually going into Brexit. We need more flexibility. So I think she was right not to make, and I hope she won't make any more specific pledges. The triple lock, you can move to a double lock, and you're still protecting pensioners because
so
you're
we're now
still
talking
indexed.
about pensions, and again, it did sound as though that 2.5% promise that David Cameron gave,
Yes.
that the basic pension would always increase at a minimum of 2.5% a year.
Yes.
That looks as though it's going, doesn't it?
I think it probably is going, and that would mean you would have a double lock. You'd still index to whichever is higher of wages and prices. Pensioners, we have done a lot on pensioner poverty through the triple lock. It's not something anybody would want to get rid of, but I fear at the moment it is, as you said, Robert, it's unaffordable and it's not entirely fair, and we're going to need,
well, it is an extraordinary state of affairs.
A bit more money.
It is an extraordinary state of affairs where retired people, when you take housing costs into account, are now richer than working people are on average.
Yes.
And even a double lock, which guarantees that pensions would go up by the higher of earnings and inflation, would keep them ahead of the rest of the population.
Yes, it would. And I think there are some very, very difficult choices ahead. I mean, the public services are under pressure. The last government actually took 4 million people out of tax altogether. Made a big difference. You know, basically every basic rate taxpayer probably benefited by about £1,000 under the last government. The last government also created an extraordinary and unprecedented number of jobs. And I thought the other thing she said that was very important is that jobs are the best route out of poverty. And I think that is the answer to John McDonnell. I don't think he fully understands that, and I think we need to sustain that after Brexit.
Alistair, do you think domestic policy issues will cut through in this campaign? You know, there is a fair amount of evidence that school funding per pupil is being squeezed, actually, on one analysis, by more than at any time since the 1970s. Health service, lots of evidence that there's not enough money. Is any of this going to cut through, or is it all going to be about Brexit?
It's not all about Brexit, but I think that one of the things that I think is happening in this election, I mean, she says it's the most important election. I don't think you can really say that because, as you pointed out to her, she already has a mandate on Brexit in terms of the referendum. And she got the vote through Parliament, not least with a lot of Labour people voting with her. But I think that what's happening in this election is it's almost as if everybody is operating on the basis that we know what the outcome is going to be.
Do we know what the outcome is going to be?
Well, we don't, because people haven't voted, but you look at the opinion polls, you sort of feel the mood. But I feel I'm living in a parallel universe, because out and about, and of course everybody says they love being out and about and talking to people, out and about, every single event that I do, every single speaking engagement I do, I ask people, are they optimistic or pessimistic about Brexit? There's massive pessimism about Brexit.
Can I just ask,
and these things are not going to cut through.
You've been very loyal to Labour today. Yeah. John Prescott has attacked your great friend Tony Blair and saying he's being desperately disloyal by implying that people should vote for other parties. Do you want Tony Blair to shut up and just put forward a Vote Labour message?
Look, I can't want Tony Blair to shut up, because this may surprise you. I've interviewed Tony Blair for GQ magazine. And it's
that is a huge surprise.
And, no, it is a surprise, because but no, I'll tell you, look, tactical voting is going to happen.
Right.
Because
should he be encouraging it?
No, well, that's up to Tony. But let me just say this. Let me say this. I think people are getting very, very worried that the majority...
I'm going to have to cut you off.
Okay,
I'm so sorry. That's all we've got time for. My thanks to John McDonnell and Theresa May, and, of course, to Alistair and Camilla. Next week, the general election starts in earnest. There'll be plenty more to discuss next Sunday. See you then. And for me, it's all about Arsenal this afternoon.